have the palace of King David, or what probably might be the palace of King David. There is a lot of debate archaeologically about this site. Essentially, Alat Mazar, who was the excavator of this site, here's the evidence for it. One, she used the Bible to determine the location. So basically, the Bible does give a bit of a roadmap to where David's palace is. So it says in the book of 2 Samuel, 2 Kings, if you use the Douay-Rheims Bible, that David, when the Philistines were attacking Jerusalem after he became king, left his palace and went up into the fortress. So we know that the palace of David would have been the fortress. The palace of David would have been outside of the fortress of Jerusalem. It would have been outside of the ancient Tel, which would have been the Temple Mount. This would put it roughly right here. Furthermore, pottery has been used by Alat Mazar to date this site to the second temple, pottery has been used to date this site to the 10th century BCE. Pottery is very distinctive, and because it was been found in the 10th century BCE, that's the time of David. We know that from our Assyrian records, when David would have been king. We know that, and counting and lining it up with the biblical chronology. Even if you think that the biblical count is off by a few years, I know there's some archaeologists who say that the 40 years may have been just rounding off David's reign. It's not inaccurate, but it's a rounded off number. It would still be pretty accurate for saying when David would have lived. It's fine. So, and also this is clearly a palatial structure and was used at later periods as administrative center by the Kingdom of Judah. They found Boleni here. This is essentially part of the royal quarter. So at some point, this was the palace of the Kingdom of Judah. At one point, at least at some point in history. Now there are contrary opinions to this. So, for example, it has been archaeology in Jerusalem is very difficult. This site is known as a stone step structure. You'll see in just a minute what it is. And there is a lot of debate as to whether or not it was built in the time of King David in the 10th century BCE, whether or not it was built by the Canaanites much earlier, even 1,000 years before David, or even much later, because we know that this structure was in use around the time of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. Maybe it was built in the time of King Hezekiah. Jerusalem was expanded by Hezekiah. So there is a lot of debate, and both sides, if they're being honest, will admit that, there is evidence for thinking both. Here we have a replica of a pillar that was found here. That's how we know it's a palatial structure. That's a very Judean style, by the way. So northern Israelite style would not have, if I recall correctly, they would not have the pointed arches, the pointed triangles in the middle. It would be a bit simpler. That's a very Judean style. It's called a Proto-Ionic pillar. Not as Phoenician, but from what I understand, probably Phoenician influence though. So there is just a lot of debate about the structure in the archaeological community. It could be the Palace of David. Now, I'll say this though. There is a difference between saying this is not the Palace of David and saying that the palace of that King David did not exist. So, not sure you can see me now. Essentially, yeah, we do know that it's pretty well confirmed that David existed because the Tel Dan Stele mentions the house of David. And this would have been like 200 years after the death of King David himself. Kind of like us talking about, say, George Washington today, or King George III of England. It will be considered quite reliable. What's more, Dr. Yossi Finkelstein of Hebrew University of Jerusalem has actually recently published a paper where he talked about the palace, where he talked about how all these uniquely Judean-style fortresses, casemate city walls with houses attached to them, which is a very boring, very unique Judean way of describing. It's very boring architectural style, but it's actually very significant, as it usually, for a large part, appears almost only in Judah. And so that indicates that there's a centralized system of designing these city walls from a central authority, and they all circle around this place, Jerusalem. So that shows the time of King David, there was, based on the chronology, there was a kingdom centered in Jerusalem at the time of David. There was knowledge of a dynasty whose founder was David, who only would have been based on the biblical text. And this is looking at the biblical text not as even as God's word, but as a purely historical document. It's probably reliable, even if you think it's off by a few years. It does mention the founding of the Davidic dynasty and all. And it shows that within comparatively short period of time, at least from a historical perspective, that they knew who the founder of the royal house of Judah was. It would have been David. Current debate among archaeologists, among the current anti-biblical debate and argument, is that David was only the king of Judah and not the kingdom of all Israel. That being said, I really should not be talking about this. I will probably release it in a later video once it's published. More details. I actually have learned in classes that we have unpublished material. They're not hiding it or delaying it. It just takes a long time to publish things in biblical archaeology, honestly, sometimes years. Archaeologists are slow, and the Israeli government is not pleased with how slow things are. They have actually found evidence that in the north, there might be some evidence for certain Solomonic gates being built at the time of David. Possibly, that might be leaning that way. Again, I'm not going to say more on that score until everything is fully published. Once that, I hope to eventually come back. There's a stone step structure. I hope to come back and make a proper YouTube video about at some point in the future. Hopefully, please pray for success in this regard. About the kingdom of David and united monarchy. I do believe united monarchy, and it is a legitimate. Even the people who deny it would admit that there are legitimate reasons for thinking it was united monarchy. They might scoff at it. Some might scoff at it more than others, but there are credible archaeologists who think that there was united monarchy. There also are some credible archaeologists who think that there wasn't one, though. Anyway. Just one more thing about David. He was a sinner like us. It is from up there that he would have seen Bathsheba bathing and sinned against God. So just a reminder that when David did that, God's response was not like some who say, let's not criticize him. God sent Nathan to call him out, just like Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre called out Pope Paul VI and John Paul II for rampant ecumenism. And remember, David did his sin privately, not even publicly. So we should never put our leaders of the church above the law of God and keep total silence, especially when it's causing grave scandal. Lots of saints. St. Maximus Confessor called out the sins of Pope Honorius I. Mind you, he tried to defend him and explain away Honorius' sins, but he called sin. He did not make any excuses about it. There were plenty of other saints, like Saint Joan of Arc. I read her trial transcripts. She was snarky with the bishops who were trying her. Snarky. Never put the law of God underneath canon law or church leaders. Yes, obey them. Yes, respect them. But that needs to come first. Also, just a reminder, this is where God said the rosary every day. This is where the prototype of the rosary was written, or at least probably some of them. The rosary, such as I have here, is based on the 150 Psalms of David. Each Hail Mary represents one of the Psalms, and in a certain way, the Psalms foreshadow the yes of the Blessed Virgin. And that's why there are 150 Hail Marys in the original 15 decades of the Rosary. That's why we at Trackhouse do 15, not two or three. That's why I do, and not the 200. That would include the Luminous Mysteries. Anyway, God bless. This is from the Stone Step Structure of Jerusalem. Excavated by Malat Mazar. If you ever get a chance in your life, please check on SSPX, Society of St. Pius X Church. God bless and have a great day.